On a warm summer afternoon deep in the heart of an ancient forest, a lone red ant named Rilo marched across the tangled roots of an old oak tree. Unlike the other ants in his colony, Rilo was not content with the repetitive life of foraging and storing food. He dreamed of adventure, of seeing what lay beyond the towering trees and endless grass fields. One day, while the colony was busy collecting food, Rilo overheard the elder ants whispering about a forbidden land, a place beyond the river where strange creatures roamed. It was said that no ant had ever returned from there. Rilo's curiosity flared like a spark in dry leaves. He had to see it for himself. As the sun began to set, Rilo quietly slipped away from the colony. He followed the scent of the wind, climbing over stones and weaving through thick blades of grass. Soon he reached the edge of the river. The water glistened under the moonlight, and the distant croaks of frogs echoed in the stillness. Determined, Rilo found a floating leaf and carefully stepped onto it. The gentle current carried him across, swaying and spinning, until he reached the other side. As he stepped onto unfamiliar ground, he felt a thrill of excitement. Everything seemed different here. The air smelled wilder, the plants were taller, and the soil was softer. As he explored, Rilo noticed something unusual, a large abandoned beetle shell. It was cracked open, and deep inside a faint glow pulsed. Curiosity tugged at him, and he cautiously climbed inside. To his astonishment, he found a tiny glowing stone nestled in the beetle's hollow chest. It shimmered like trapped sunlight. Just as Rilo reached out to touch it, a low growl rumbled from the shadows. He turned sharply to see a massive centipede emerging from the darkness, its many legs clicking against the ground. Its beady eyes locked onto Rilo, sensing an intruder. Without thinking, Rilo grabbed the glowing stone and darted out of the shell. The centipede lunged, its sharp mandibles snapping just inches away. Rilo ran faster than he ever had, leaping over twigs and dodging fallen leaves. The centipede was fast, but Rilo was faster. Ahead, he spotted a dandelion stem leaning over the river. He scrambled up its stalk and leapt off just as the centipede struck. The creature missed its target and tumbled into the water with a splash. Panting, Rilo landed on the other side, the glowing stone still clutched in his tiny mandibles. He had done it. He had ventured into the forbidden land and returned. When he finally reached his colony, the elder ants gasped at the sight of the stone. They had only heard of such things in legends, stones that carried the warmth of the sun and brought life to the coldest of winters. From that day on, Rilo was no longer just another ant in the colony. He became a legend, a symbol of courage and adventure. The red ant who had dared to cross the river, who had defied fear, and who had returned with the light of the unknown. As Rilo stood before the colony, the glowing stone pulsing in his mandibles, a hushed awe spread among the ants. No one had ever dared to cross the river, let alone return with something so mysterious. The elder ants examined the stone, whispering among themselves, "This is no ordinary stone," one of them finally said, his antennae twitching with excitement. "It is said that such stones hold the power of the sun itself. But how did it come to rest inside a beetle's shell?" The question lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Rilo, still catching his breath, realized that he had only scratched the surface of a far greater mystery. That night, As the other ants drifted into sleep, he sat near the entrance of the colony, staring at the glowing stone. Something about it felt alive. Then, as if responding to his thoughts, the stone flickered. A tiny spark shot from its surface, and for a brief moment Rilo saw something in his mind. A vision of a vast underground chamber, deep beneath the forbidden land. Strange symbols lined its walls, and at its center stood a towering structure, carved from stone, with more glowing orbs nestled within. Rilo jolted awake, his tiny heart pounding. Was it a dream? Or was the stone trying to tell him something? He knew one thing for sure. His adventure was far from over. Determined to uncover the truth, Rilo decided he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. The next morning, he sought out his closest friend, Kiva, a swift and fearless warrior ant. She had always believed in Rilo's wild stories, and when he told her about the vision, her eyes gleamed with excitement. "This is bigger than just one adventure," she said. "If there are more stones like this, we have to find them." Rilo and Kiva formed a team. 4 more ants joined them, each skilled in different ways. There was Cirque, the strongest ant in the colony; Lani, an expert in tunnels and underground maps; Jex, a clever trickster who could slip past any danger; and Orla, a wise gatherer who knew the land like the back of her antennae. Together they set out at dawn, heading once more toward the forbidden land. Crossing the river was no easy task. This time they built a raft from sturdy twigs and leaves, tying them together with strands of spider silk. As they drifted across, the river seemed darker than before, as if it sensed their purpose. Strange ripples moved beneath the surface, and just as they neared the shore, a monstrous shadow emerged from the depths. A giant water strider, its long legs like spears, skated toward them with terrifying speed. Its glossy black eyes reflected the morning sun as it raised a deadly leg to strike. "Brace yourselves," Rilo shouted. Cirque, the strongest among them, leaped onto the strider's leg and clamped down with his powerful mandibles. The creature screeched, trying to shake him off, but Kiva and Jex worked quickly to steer the raft toward the shore. Cirque held on with all his might until finally the raft bumped against land. He let go at the last moment, tumbling onto the sand as the strider hissed and retreated into the water. "That was close," Lani panted, helping Cirque up. But there was no time to rest. They had entered the forbidden land once more, and this time they were going deeper. The forest here was different, darker, filled with unfamiliar scents and eerie sounds. The leaves above blocked much of the sunlight, and the air was thick with the hum of unseen creatures. Guided by the vision Rilo had seen, they moved carefully, avoiding the scuttling legs of centipedes and the watchful eyes of hunting spiders. Each step brought them closer to something ancient, something forgotten. Then, after hours of travel, they found it. A vast, gaping hole in the earth stretched before them. The edges were lined with twisted roots, and deep within its shadows, the faintest glow pulsed, just like the stone Rilo carried. "This is it," Orla whispered, "the place in your vision." They descended carefully, climbing down with the help of roots and cracks in the rock. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became. The tunnel soon opened into a massive chamber, just as Rilo had seen in his vision. Carvings covered the walls, ancient symbols that none of them could understand. But what truly took their breath away was the structure at the center. A towering stone altar stood before them, and within it, dozens of glowing stones rested, pulsing softly like tiny trapped suns. Before they could move closer, the ground trembled. A deep, echoing sound rumbled through the chamber, growing louder by the second. Something was waking up. The adventurers turned toward the far end of the cave as a massive shape emerged from the darkness, a creature unlike anything they had ever seen. It was an ant, but not like them. It was ancient, twice the size of any ant in their colony, its exoskeleton darkened with age. Its eyes glowed with the same golden light as the stones, and when it spoke, its voice was like the whisper of the wind through the trees. "You have come far," the ancient ant said, "but are you ready for the truth?" Rilo swallowed hard, his antennae twitching with anticipation. Their greatest adventure was only beginning. Rilo and his team stood frozen before the ancient ant, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. The chamber's air felt charged with something beyond their understanding. The walls pulsed with light, as if the entire cavern was alive, breathing along with the mysterious creature. Who are you?" Rilo finally managed to ask, his voice small against the vastness of the cave. The ancient ant's mandibles shifted, and when it spoke again, its voice carried an echo that seemed to vibrate within their very shells. "I am what remains of the first colony," it said, "a colony that existed before yours, before the river divided the land. We thrived here, guided by the stones of light, until the great silence fell upon us." The adventurers exchanged glances. None of them had ever heard of this so-called first colony. Their history only spoke of their own colony, the Red Hill, and the battles they had fought against rival colonies and natural threats, but nothing of an ancient civilization. "What was the Great Silence?" Kiva asked, her warrior instincts on high alert. The ancient ant stepped forward, its massive form moving gracefully despite its size. "The Great Silence was our downfall," it said. "We built our colony around the power of these stones, using their warmth to grow food even in the coldest seasons, to defend against the great predators that once roamed this land. But we grew too dependent, and we forgot the cost of such power. One day, the stones began to dim. We did not understand why. Our workers dug deeper, searching for more, but we only found emptiness. Then came the hunger." "The hunger?" Jex repeated, his usual smirk gone. The ancient ant's eyes darkened, as if remembering something painful. "Creatures came from below Sahan," it said, lowering its voice. "They smelled the stones. They desired their warmth. They did not just devour the light, they devoured us." A cold silence fell over the group. Even the ever-bold Cirque took a step back. "They came in endless waves," the ancient ant continued. "We fought, we lost. Those of us who remained sealed the entrance to the deep tunnels, trapping the creatures within. The colony did not survive. I am the last." Rilo felt a shiver run through his legs. This wasn't just a story, this was a warning. "But the stones still glow," Orla said, her eyes locked on the pulsing light. "If the creatures were trapped, why haven't they returned?" The ancient ant turned its gaze toward the altar. The stones are fading again, it said, and when they do, the seal will break. A sharp crack echoed through the cavern. The adventurers whirled around. A long, jagged fracture had appeared in the far wall of the chamber. Something was stirring beyond it. The ground trembled, tiny bits of rock falling from the ceiling. A deep, guttural clicking sound came from the other side of the wall. Something unnatural, something hungry. "They're waking up," the ancient ant whispered. "They can smell the stones again." Rilo's mind raced. They had come seeking adventure, seeking answers, but they had stumbled upon something far greater. If the creatures that had destroyed the first colony were about to return, that meant one thing: they had to stop it. "How do we reseal the wall?" Rilo asked, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his insides. The ancient ant studied him for a moment. "You are bold," it said, "but the wall is weak. It will not hold. There's only one way to stop them." It turned to the altar, its antennae twitching as it examined the glowing stones. "We must destroy the stones." A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. "Destroy them? But they're the only thing keeping the creatures at bay," Lonnie protested. The ancient ant's gaze darkened. "They are also what calls them. As long as the stones exist, the creatures will never stop hunting them. We must end the cycle." Rilo clenched his mandibles. Destroying the stones meant losing a power unlike anything their colony had ever known. But if they didn't, the entire land could be overrun. Another crack split through the air. This time, a chunk of the wall crumbled away, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. And in that darkness, something moved. A long, glistening limb stretched out, curling like a claw. They had no time left. Rilo made his decision. "Kiva, Cirque, help the elder," he ordered. "Lonnie, find a way to collapse the tunnel behind us. Jex, Orla, get ready to move." His friends didn't hesitate. They knew this wasn't just about their adventure anymore. This was survival. The ancient ant began chanting in a low, vibrating hum, touching each of the stones on the altar. One by one, they flared to life, glowing brighter and brighter. The wall cracked further. More limbs pushed through, and a clicking sound filled the chamber, a sound that sent shivers down their shells. "Now," Rilo shouted. Kiva and Cirque slammed their weight into the altar. The structure groaned. The stones pulsed violently. And then, a blinding explosion of golden light filled the cavern. The chamber shook as the stones shattered, sending shards of glowing dust into the air. The creatures on the other side of the wall let out an ear-piercing screech as the tunnel collapsed, sealing them away once more. The last of the stones flickered, and then darkness. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was their own breathing. Then a weak but satisfied chuckle came from the ancient ant. "You have done what we could not," it said, its voice barely above a whisper. "The hunger will sleep once more." Rilo turned to look at the elder ant, but something was wrong. The glow in its eyes was fading. "What's happening?" Rilo asked, stepping forward. "The stones were my life force," the ancient ant said. "I remained only because they remained." It took a slow, shuddering breath. "But now I can rest." With one final sigh, the ancient ant's body crumbled to dust, scattering into the windless cavern. A deep silence followed. The adventurers stood there for what felt like an eternity, taking in everything that had happened. They had won, but at a cost. Rilo turned to his team, their shells covered in dust and scratches, their eyes wide with exhaustion. "We need to go home," he said. No one argued. As they made their way back to the surface, climbing out of the dark chamber and into the light of the forest, Rilo took one last look at the land behind him. The power of the stones was gone, but so was the threat. For the first time in centuries, the land would be truly free, and their adventure would become a legend. As Rilo and his team emerged from the underground chamber, the first light of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the treetops in gold. The once ominous shadows of the forbidden land now seemed softer, less menacing. The air, which had carried an unnatural stillness, now hummed with the sounds of morning, chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the distant croak of frogs by the river. But though the world above looked unchanged, Rilo knew better. The ancient power of the stones was gone. The creatures had been sealed away once more, but their hunger, their existence, would always remain a danger lurking beneath the land. And the only ones who knew the truth were the 6 ants standing on that quiet forest floor. "We should head back," Kiva said, brushing dust off her shell. "The colony needs to know what happened." Rilo nodded, but something about her words weighed on his mind. Could they really tell the colony everything? Could they risk spreading fear about a danger that might never return? As they crossed the river, their raft lighter than before, the reality of their journey sank in. The glowing stone that had sparked their adventure was gone, along with the power it carried. And yet, Rilo felt no regret. What they had found was something greater than power. They had uncovered history. They had become part of something ancient, something far bigger than themselves. When they reached the Red Hill, their colony was already stirring. Workers marched in neat lines, foragers carried supplies, and the scent of fresh morning dew lingered in the air. It was as if nothing had changed, but Rilo and his team knew better. As they entered the central chambers, the elder ants turned to them, their antennae twitching with curiosity. "You have returned," one of them said, "and yet you do not carry the stone." The adventurers exchanged glances. The moment had come. Rilo took a deep breath. "We found something greater than a stone," he said. "We found a forgotten colony, a lost history, and we found something terrible, something that almost woke again." The elders listened in silence as Rilo and his team told their tale. They spoke of the first colony, of the creatures trapped beneath the earth, of the stone's power and the cost of keeping them. When they finished, a heavy silence settled over the room. Finally, one of the elders spoke. "You have done what no ant has ever done before," he said. "You have looked beyond the world we know. You have uncovered the truth of what came before us." Another elder leaned forward. "But what you speak of is dangerous knowledge. If fear spreads, it could bring chaos to the colony. And yet, if the threat ever rises again, we must be prepared." The elders debated among themselves. Some believed the story should be shared, others thought it should remain hidden. But in the end, they reached a decision. "This tale," the eldest among them finally said, "will not be forgotten. It will be preserved in the deepest chambers, passed down only to the wisest among us. We will watch for signs, for tremors in the earth, for the return of the hunger. The elders turned to Rilo and his team. You are no longer mere workers or warrior, the elder declared. You are now guardians of the lost. The words settled over them like a sacred bond. They were no longer just adventurers. They were the keepers of a secret that must never be lost. From that day on, Rilo and his team lived not just as heroes, but as watchers of the land, protectors of the colony's future. Their names were spoken in whispers, their story passed through careful lips. And though the stones were gone, and the creatures sealed away deep beneath the earth, something still waited, still listened, still dreamed of hunger, and the guardians of the lost would always be watching. Years passed, and the legend of the guardians of the lost grew within the hidden chambers of the Red Hill. Rilo and his team never spoke of their journey to the younger ants, but their presence alone carried an air of mystery. They were no longer just foragers or warriors. They were something more, silent protectors, always alert for the slightest tremor beneath the ground. As time went on, the colony thrived. Generations of ants were born, lived and passed, never knowing the darkness that had once stirred beneath their feet. The forbidden land remained untouched, avoided by instinct and fear. The river that once seemed like a barrier now felt like a silent guardian, keeping whatever lurked below from reaching the world above. But Rilo knew that peace was never permanent. One evening, as he stood alone at the colony's entrance, watching the last light of day fade into a sea of stars, he felt it, a shift in the air, so faint it might have been his imagination. He pressed a foot against the soil, still solid, still quiet. But he had learned long ago that danger did not announce itself with a roar. It crept in like a whisper. Kiva approached him, her once fiery energy now tempered with wisdom. You feel it too, she said, not as a question but as a statement. Rilo nodded. It's been so long. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a story. Kiva gave him a knowing look. We both know stories come from truth. A pause stretched between them, filled with the sounds of the night. Do you think it will ever return? She asked softly. Rilo exhaled, his antennae twitching toward the horizon. Maybe not in our lifetime, maybe not in the next, but one day someone will hear the whispers again. Someone will feel the tremors. And when that time comes, I hope the colony remembers. He turned to Kiva with a small, tired smile. That's why we're here. She nodded, to make sure the story doesn't die. As the stars glowed above them, as the colony slept peacefully within the earth, the guardians of the lost stood watch, not because they feared the darkness, but because they knew it would always be there, waiting, and they would be ready.